Good morning, everybody. My name's Nick Thurlbeck and I'm the Chair of Commerce Ballarat. Thanks for joining us all this morning. I begin firstly by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wathaurong people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our organisation has discussed this a lot and we believe recovery looks a lot like what you are doing now. If you're not working on your business, if you are not communicating with your customers and suppliers, if you are not looking for innovation, then recovery is going to be much harder, if not impossible. Now, before I introduce our panel today, can I welcome some special guests we have tuning in today? Councillor Ben Taylor, Mayor, Councillor Belinda Coates, Councillor Jim Rinaldi, Councillor Samantha McIntosh, Councillor Grant Tillett, Councillor Daniel Maloney, who are all joining us online this morning. And of course, thank you to our Biznet sponsors, Adroit Assurance and Risk, BJT Legal, People at Work, Vindex, Radio Ballarat, and of course, the City of Ballarat. I'd like to introduce our panellists now. Firstly, the Honourable Martin Pakula MP. Victorian Minister for Jobs, Innovation and Trade, Minister for Tourism, Sport and Major Events, Minister for Racing and Member for Keysborough. Welcome Martin and thanks for joining. Secondly, I'd like to welcome David Canny, owner of the Red Lion Hotel here in Ballarat and AHA Victoria President and AHA National Vice President. Welcome David and thanks for joining us. And Jane Lopez, who most people in Ballarat would know, co-owner of Webster's Market and Cafe. Thanks to you too, Jane, for joining us this morning. Now I'm going to pass things over to David Canny, who's going to facilitate the conversation throughout this morning. So we really welcome plenty of questions coming through, so send them across and we look forward to working through the panel that we have this morning. Enjoy everybody.
Thanks, Nick, and good morning, everybody. Minister, let's jump straight to it and talk about the reopen and the stimulus stage if we can. It's been a big focus in our tourism markets about international tourism and the strategy for international tourism. Who and how is going to facilitate the change and the strategy, obviously going back to look at domestic tourism to reinvigorate regional areas such as Ballarat?
Oh, yeah, thanks for the question, Dave, and thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. Look, I'm as keenly aware as anyone about the difficulties for domestic tourism that have been created, not just by COVID-19, but by that coming off the back of bushfires. Right now, as you know, we're still in many respects, survival mode. And we've got, there's been a number of announcements by government, state and federal in regards to that, whether it's been the business support grants that we've provided, the commercial tenancy relief scheme, the JobKeeper payment from the Commonwealth. So that's been our focus at the moment. And we are still in a state of emergency where the message of the Chief Health Officer is for people to stay at home fundamentally, other than in a few exceptional circumstances, whether it's going to work, going to shop, visiting sick relatives, or doing your own medical care, or indeed for some basic exercise. So that's constraining our ability to get things going at the moment because we are still in that phase. That current state of emergency ends on Monday, the 11th of May, and there'll be some decisions made in the next few days about what, if any, changes can be made in regards to that. There is a group that's been convened that has been meeting reasonably regularly with Felicia Mariani from the Victorian Tourism Industry Council, Brendan McClements from Visit Victoria, some of our universities, the Melbourne Convention Centre and Convention Bureau. We've been talking to some of our regional tourism boards and we've been talking to our overseas offices to pull together a whole economic recovery package. But as you've indicated, we think the first part of that will be about rebooting domestic tourism because people will be allowed to travel around their state and then their country, I suspect well before international visitors will be coming back in, and indeed before Australians will travel overseas. So in that initial period of recovery, when some of the restrictions start to be lifted, we think there'll actually be quite an opportunity for domestic tourism, because a lot of people who might have otherwise got on planes and headed overseas, in all likelihood will not have the opportunity to do so. We don't think the Commonwealth will be opening international travel routes. So people will, you know, once people are able to start moving around their state and their city and their country again, that'll be holidaying that will happen domestically. Now, when exactly that starts, it's not clear yet. That'll be up to the Commonwealth Chief Medical Officer, the AHPPC and State Chief Health Officers. But when it starts, it will be fundamentally domestic, and it will be backed by a significant Visit Victoria marketing campaign when we get to that point. You might recall that after the bushfires, we had a campaign which was known as A Short Stay Goes a Long Way. It was all about encouraging Victorians to get back out to regional Victoria. And I imagine we'll see something very similar when movement starts again around the state. So there are a number of things going on, David. It does have to wait until we are moving about more freely again. But hopefully, if we can continue to see a downward trend in the numbers, if we can see the benefits of the 100,000 tests that we're intending to run over this 2-week period, which we've already done something like 55,000 of, probably over 60 now, then that will give us options in order to start to allow people to get back out to our regions.
So, Minister, looking at what other states are doing, and I know we're very different, you can't just copy or imagine that it is all the same, but is there any appetite from the government to open regions prior to the metro hotspots and open regional Victoria first?
Well, as I say, look, we've got a decision to make in the lead up to the 11th of May, but this thing is changing very quickly, David, and indeed the attitude of regional Victoria is changing very quickly too. I remember very clearly in the lead up to Easter, we had a number of CEOs from various shires around the place who were urging us to ensure that Victorians did not travel to their region. They were saying, you know, keep those bloody dirty Melburnians at home. We don't want them coming up here and spreading our virus. And that was absolutely the attitude up to Easter. And then we've started to detect a little bit of a change in the post-Easter period, which I think has coincided with the very public reduction of the numbers of infections as a consequence of the lockdown. The risk, of course, is that if you open up too quickly and in an uncontrolled way, you will see those numbers start to grow again. We actually saw yesterday that the highest number for a couple of weeks. Now, that was mainly concentrated at one meatworks, but we still did see 22 new infections that were confirmed yesterday. And I suspect if you saw those numbers start to grow, regional Victoria would very quickly start to come back to us with that message of stay away. So you know, it will all come down to the question of what is the message from the public health officials. If the message ceases to be stay at home and changes to, well, you can now move about again, but please maintain social distancing, then I think at that point people will naturally gravitate towards the regions. It might be that the message remains stay at home for another few weeks. We'll know more in the next few days as we make those decisions about May 11.
So that date, May 11, which is very firmly in all our diaries, and we wait for that day just to see how that looks. Is there anything you can possibly share with us about what your expectations might be? Obviously, we know this is a very fragile situation, but also, is there a concern for social disobedience starting to occur if some regulations aren't lifted?
Oh, look, we're always, I'll deal with the second part first. Look, we have been from the absolute start of this very keenly appreciative of the fact that I suppose social public permission for what the government is doing is fragile. We expect it to be fragile in the same way that the virus and the successes that we've had is fragile. We know that people need to understand the thinking behind what we're doing. We know that people need to see a benefit from what the government's doing. And I think we've seen a benefit in terms of the massive reduction in the infection rate, but they also need to see a dividend. And the dividend will be, even if it's gradual, a slow return to normality or a relative normality as soon as the medical experts think it's safe to do so. So I'm hopeful. I don't want to speculate about what might be the case from next Monday, because it would just be speculation, and I don't want to give people false hope or false expectations. I think it would be reasonable to say I expect to see some liberalisation of where we're at. I think it will be, I think it will be gradual, and then, the way that National Cabinet is working, and by the way, they're meeting on, I believe it's on Friday, to make those decisions in the lead up to Mother's Day, amongst other things. So I think it will be gradual, and to do this thing smart and to do it responsibly will involve some liberalisation, then more testing to see whether or not that's creating an upsurge in infections. And if the numbers stay manageable, then they can start to consider the next wave of liberalisation. So they'll step through it gradually, but I think at each stage, the idea will be, or the plan will be, to give Victorians and to give Australians some dividend, some benefit from the incredibly responsible approach people have taken so far.
Jane, we might throw to you and see you sitting there in uniform, your chef uniform there this morning on a beautiful Ballarat morning with the sunshine at your back. You've decided to stay open throughout this crisis. I wanted you to share your thoughts around that and the success or lack of with such a decision.
Well, I guess initially we chose to stay open for our customers and staff. I mean, the general feel was nervousness, I think, amongst everybody. And I think for us to be here, it offered at least one form of normality for people's day. So for our staff to come to work, and obviously our customers to have that one outing to grab a coffee or, a loaf of bread or some milk or whatever. So that was like our main reasoning behind it. I think it also, we're concerned about the mental health implications of, I guess, telling our staff to have to go home, and we don't know when we'll be back from here. So there were our main reasons. We introduced, I guess, a grocery store into our service and offered that as a delivery. And it's been successful. It's kept everybody employed. We've been able to, deliver to the region, our local customers, with not just groceries, but the food we offer, coffee we offer. And I think that's been really successful, and we've just adjusted with that by with our POS system. It was a really easy integration. So for us, I think it's been successful, but we're also, I guess, set up to do that reasonably efficiently with how we're already set up previous to this. So does that answer that question?
It does. And you've utilised JobKeeper?
We have, yeah. So we've got about 50% of our staff that we can put through onto JobKeeper, which is great. So that's definitely helped. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, thanks, okay. And obviously JobKeeper has some restrictions, particularly around cash flow and having to carry that payment for the month. And if I can just throw to you, Minister, on JobKeeper, to get your thoughts around, obviously that we're happy with the scheme and to be able to engage, and as Jane said, to be able to keep staff on and keep them trained so that recovery is made easier. And I think that's the main point. Most of us are using JobKeeper is to help with the recovery stage, because it's certainly not a money-making exercise to be operating these businesses, even though we've seen some great innovation from the hospitality sector in delivery and service. But JobKeeper runs out in September 27. Is there any push from the state government to ensure that such assistance goes longer than that, because the recovery is going to take a lot longer than past September 27?
Dave, I've got no doubt that this will be a feature of conversation at National Cabinet, which for those who don't appreciate what it is, it's basically the Prime Minister meeting with all of the states and territory premiers and chief ministers. We had this conversation at Victorian Cabinet yesterday, and it's been raised with me by Paul Guerra, who runs the Victorian Chamber. There is a real concern about what will happen at the conclusion of JobKeeper in terms of the ability of businesses to retain employment. Look, it's possible that the economy will be largely reopened at that point, but I think there's every possibility that it won't be. I think there's every possibility that there'll still be substantial pockets of closure and businesses that have taken a hit during this period that may not reopen, and there'll be businesses which are exposed to international tourism and international students and international trade, which will all still be in a very difficult situation. I think it's inevitable that the Commonwealth will have to contemplate an extension of JobKeeper in some form. I don't know whether they will be prepared to do so, but I think that there will be substantial push from state premiers for the Commonwealth to contemplate that. I know that the first tranche of it has been extraordinarily expensive from a Commonwealth deficit point of view. I think it's a $130 billion program, but there is, I think there will be enormous pressure on them to carry it on, perhaps at least until the end of the year. JobKeeper, I don't want to be critical of it. It's been an exceptionally good program. We are starting to see some issues with it. I know that as some businesses are looking to reopen and they have some employees who are on JobKeeper and some who are ineligible, those that are ineligible and haven't been receiving payment may now receive sort of the double whammy effect, because the employer will be much more inclined to use JobKeeper staff as they reopen, because they are paid for by the Treasurer. And that's understandable from a company point of view. But again, it goes to the question of whether or not the Commonwealth should have made those payments more broadly available. I understand that it's not a bottomless pit of money. As a state government minister, I know that all too well. But there are some design issues with it that I think we'll start to see come to fruition over the next few months.
One of those big design issues for our industry is the lack of support, particularly for international chefs who are on a road to residency, not on a pathway, but not there yet, and are virtually entitled to nothing, or are entitled to nothing. And a lot of hospitality businesses cannot afford to lose those chefs simply because we need them when we reopen. They've been paying their taxes and their Medicare on the way through, and they seem to be being left out to dry a little bit. Last week, your government announced a $1,500 payment for international students. Is there any such plan that could be extended into hospitality for those who aren't entitled to any entitlements at all?
So the international student announcement was actually 1,100, and it was, as I think you identify with regards to your temporary visa holders in the hospitality sector, international students had fallen right through the cracks. We've normally got in Victoria something like 250,000 international students, and for those who aren't aware, it is our biggest service export industry. But from a pure humanity point of view, a lot of those international students are people who, just like everybody else, have lost their jobs. They've been doing casual work in insecure type employment while they've been studying, and their jobs have gone, and they were eligible for absolutely no payments from the Commonwealth at all. So their universities have been making some payments to them, and we've supplemented that with what is the equivalent of 2 weeks of job seeker, which we're hoping that their universities will match. So that will keep food on the table for a month. We are keenly aware of the issue of temporary visa holders in other occupations. It's not just hospitality. There's a lot of temporary visa holders, for instance, in the horticultural sector and other parts of the economy. You would not be surprised to know, David, that this has also been an issue that has been raised with the government by the trade union movement, because a lot of they are representing a lot of these workers. And it's something, I can't make an announcement about it today, but it is something we are looking at, because we recognise you know, this is something that the Commonwealth at a national level should have addressed, but we have a, you know, there is a genuinely human problem here, not just for the employers of these people, but for the people themselves who, in many respects, have absolutely no way of looking after themselves at the moment.
And part of your portfolio, obviously, is to reinvigorate the regions.
Yeah.
And keen to get your thoughts around two fairly big infrastructure projects which have been high on our list well before this disaster has occurred. And I speak of particularly the regional rail network and also the Melbourne Airport rail link, and government's appetite to get on with those projects.
Yeah, well, anyone who's heard the Premier speak, David, would know that you know, we don't think for a moment that government-led infrastructure spending can fill the entire hole left by the private sector in this during this crisis. We know that we need to do a lot to encourage private sector investment and to ensure that the private sector is able to start to re-engage people and re-employ. But we also think there's a very big role in terms of stimulating the economy for government investment, and infrastructure investment is the most significant way that we will be able to do that. So we have no intention of stopping the government's infrastructure agenda. Melbourne Airport rail link remains a very high priority, as does level crossing removal, as do some of the changes we're proposing in regards to our regional road and rail network. But we're also in the market for a range of infrastructure projects, whether they be small or large, that we can get away quickly, where we can get shovels in the ground and start to use infrastructure to get people back to work. So I think you will see a very, very significant government infrastructure agenda. I think that will be about all of those things that we've previously announced, and perhaps a number of additional things that have been on the back burner for a long period of time, whether that's lots of regional sporting infrastructure. So to those councillors who are listening, and I had this conversation with regional cities leadership the other day on a telephone hookup. If you've got infrastructure projects that are on the smaller side, but which can be which can have shovels in the ground this side of Christmas, let me know what they are. Because there's a process in government where I'll feed that information in, and there might be an opportunity to get some of those started.
Thank you. Jane, if you just cross back to have a chat about coming out or hitting the recovery phase and coming out of this hibernation phase, what are the challenges you're going to have as a small business, and hence what assistance do you think you could be required from both government, local government?
Well, I guess for us, the biggest concern is going to be the hiring and retraining of staff to come back to the capacity that we were operating at. So we've kept almost all of our staff on, or all those that have wanted to stay working, but still that won't get us back to the capacity, especially in the kitchen area. It's always been probably something, training and chefs takes a little bit of time, and that's probably where I can see that's going to be the difficult spot for us to get back to how we were operating previously.
So, Minister, is there an opportunity for agencies in the region to partner with government to be able to provide those services to get people back to work as quickly as we can?
Look, I'm sure there are, David. I'm not the Minister for Skills or Higher Education, but we have been, as part of the Working for Victoria program, we've been partnering with TAFE as it is to ensure that those people who are coming through Working for Victoria, who might have lost their jobs in one part of the economy but have been engaged either by ourselves or by council to do some other important work, whether it is indeed some food preparation or some sanitation work or some work at hotel quarantine. We've been engaging with TAFE to ensure that we can make Working for Victoria as useful and as valuable as possible, and so that people going into those jobs have some basic training. I've got no doubt that as we come out of that, there'll be discussions with Minister Tierney about how we can use our skills and post-secondary education sector and our TAFE sector to ensure that people get that refresher training that they need so that businesses can hit the ground running. It'll be a very important part of recovery.
And where do organisations like Commerce Ballarat fit into that plan to obviously be able to support members through the recovery and the funding and those? When a lot of members won't or are finding it hard cash flow wise for membership of such organisations, will support be there for these sorts of groups?
That feels like a Dorothy, David. I've been in discussions with Jody Gillette over the last couple of weeks, and I should at this point pay credit to Minister Pulford who put Jody and I together. So over the next couple of days, I'm waiting for the brief so that out of the business support grant, there'll be a modest but important payment made to our big, the sort of big 4 regional chambers, but also some money available for the smaller ones, so that they can continue to support their members. So over the next week, I expect that there'll be an announcement about some support provided to Commerce Ballarat, and that will allow Commerce Ballarat to continue to provide that support. And then in terms of the way that issues are fed into government, I think, at this time when there are a million things going on, when you've got, in terms of my portfolios, apart from all of the things we've talked about, the business support grants working for Victoria, I've also got a procurement role where I'm trying to ensure that we've got enough ventilators. So we had another 100 land from overseas the other day, and we're working with a local manufacturer in Ballarat, Gecko Systems, who are trying to help manufacture one as well, and a couple of other manufacturers to boot. So there are a million different things going on, dealing with the AFL, dealing with the racing industry. It is really important that issues and concerns are fed into the process, because when there's a million things going on, it's easy for things to be missed. So Commerce Ballarat, what I would invite Commerce Ballarat to do is make sure that they're corresponding with me, with Minister Symes, with Minister Pulford, making sure that issues that we might otherwise not be focused on, whether it's training or the extension of JobKeeper or things of that nature, are brought to our attention so that we can feed them into the processes of government and make sure that they're addressed.
Thank you. And if we just move on to the issue of landlords and tenants, which many of our listeners are either one or the other, if not employees, and I know you've been working solely over the weekend on this project, and we appreciate your support on this. Would you like to share your understanding of the code and the way that's going to work in Victoria between that relationship?
Look, the Commonwealth asked all states and territories to do some work on a commercial tenancies relief scheme. The general expectation is that that commercial landlords and their tenants negotiate, one-on-one, an appropriate rent reduction, whether that's a waiver or a deferral or a combination of both, to ensure that tenants are able to, maintain their leases and their tenancies and get through the other side of this crisis. We recognise that they will not, and we've put out some principles that go to the question of what sorts of factors should be taken into account. We recognise that won't always be possible for tenants and landlords to reach agreement. So we've charged the Small Business Commissioner with effectively acting as the mediator where disputes arise. And if through the small business mediation process agreement still can't be reached, then these things can be dealt with, through VCAT or through the courts. But we would really hope it doesn't get to that. Now, you made reference, David, to some work that happened over the weekend. It is unfortunately the case that there are some commercial tenants in the pub sector where they are part of a larger group, and the fact that they are part of that larger group then effectively takes them outside the parameters of the Commonwealth scheme, because when you agglomerate all of the different hotels that might be part of a group, the total value of that goes outside the value of the scheme. And there are some, how would you describe them, perverse incentives occasionally for landlords in those circumstances to not come to the table because there is a problem that, they're under the regulatory regime. If the tenant defaults the liquor license reverts to the landlord. I think I've described that problem about right. So we've made $40 million of the business support fund available to deal with those situations where effectively we've got a very short-term problem where landlords won't negotiate because their incentive is not to, and we will, we've got a group set up which I think the AHA is represented on, but which is chaired by Mark Stone, the former CEO of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce, which will provide some effectively short-term bridging funds to those hotel tenants to ensure that that problem is avoided, while we look at what kind of regulatory or legislative change might be needed to avoid this problem in the future.
Thank you, Minister. I've just had a question just in regard hotels. So while we're talking about it, I might just answer that. Just in regard what the AHA is doing to get pubs back open, or anyone who holds a general licence, who are the ones we represent, which is about 1,100 venues across the state, from the Royal Hotel in Rainbow to Crown Tower. So a very diverse group of members. But it's all about meeting with government, which we're doing later this week, to map out our plan, how we can reopen safely. And we're very aware, if anyone thinks that the industry organisations are going to dictate to this government when they open, they're very, very wrong. This is going to be decided by our government on health advice, and we've just got to make sure that when that decision comes, that we're ready to go. And we're going to equip all our members with the tools to be able to reopen. Things from signage to online training for staff prior to opening, getting the hygiene measures and cleanliness. They're very clean places, our pubs, but we're going to up the ante as far as the hygiene procedures, sanitise the doors, provide our members with all the signage required for floor distancing, social distancing throughout the venue, so that we can have the measures in place, that we get the trust back of our customers. It's not just a matter of the government saying we're ready to go, it's a matter of the customers believing that we are ready to go as well, and trusting our premises to be able to come back. One thing, a sticking point for us is when we close down, the 1 person per 4 square metres is very, 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 very restrictive for all hospitality venues, and a number of venues simply would not open under those restrictions. We'll be pushing hard for the 1.5 metre social distancing throughout a whole venue, as is the Northern Territory model. And this can be done at about a 1 to 2.5 to 3 metres per square metre, 1 person, which makes it far more viable in the initial stages to get open. So that will be our position when we go to government later this week and try and map out our pathway out.
Yeah. Can I just add to that, David? It's one of the things we're very keenly aware of, that there are really 2 questions or 3 questions here. Can pubs, cafes, restaurants reopen, and when? If so, what will be the rules and the criteria around it? And thirdly, and as you've just identified, which in those circumstances will choose to, and which will choose to stay closed? Because we are, in case anybody doesn't appreciate this, we are keenly aware that whatever restrictions are put in place by the Chief Health Officer and by health officials more generally will determine which establishments are prepared to reopen and for whom it's economical. It will be economical for some, and it may be uneconomical for others, and that's going to be that's why, again, I think the liberalising is going to be gradual, as some places reopen and potentially some stay closed for a bit longer.
And Minister, you touched on local government before, and regarding infrastructure projects and what is ready to go. What else do you see as their major responsibility in this time, when we've seen federal government come, with buckets of money, as the state government has, with liquor licence fees being returned, payroll tax being returned to get cash back into the pockets of business?
Well, look, we're working really closely with local government, particularly on the Working for Victoria program. So, we've got $500 million which we're rolling out to ensure that we can keep, thousands of people who would otherwise be unemployed in a job. And it's not by any means going to employ all of those people who've lost their jobs, but it will employ many. And so we're doing already a number of deals with local government where we're providing funding so that they can employ people to do a range of things that need to be done, whether it's about public cleanliness or really any number of jobs that can be done by local government. We understand that local government is in a difficult position because the Commonwealth JobKeeper payments don't apply to the employees of local government. But Minister Somyurek, who is the local government minister, and I have made it clear that, you know, we would like to see local government keep as many people on as possible, and working with them on the Working for Victoria program is helping them to do that. Beyond that, I think it's really about ensuring that the concerns of any local community is being properly addressed and conveyed to government. You know, there are some local government areas in regional Victoria where the CEO or the mayor is incredibly, they're incredibly proactive in making sure that government is aware of local issues and local desires. I mentioned earlier about how some were pretty vocal in the lead up to Easter, telling us that they didn't want tourists up there. But they're letting us know what kind of infrastructure projects can be funded, what kind of pressures local businesses are under, what is the appetite for local communities to have tourists return, and any other problems really that are emerging in their community that need to be addressed by government.
Thank you. And mindful that the time is running out, and we don't want to miss that big question, which is the important portfolio that you hold, Minister, whether it is a portfolio or a passion. But it's been quite incredible. The racing industry has been able to continue throughout this, which is, I'm wondering if there's any learnings from that we can take on board for our industries. Mm. And the big question is, surely we're going to have crowds back at the Spring Carnival.
Look, I'll deal with the last one first. We can't really answer that with any certainty. I think if we don't have domestic eradication of the virus, and look, that is something that is possible. You've seen already in, I think Western Australia now have had 0 new cases for quite a few days on end. That's also been the case in the Northern Territory. So we are starting to, I think health officials are starting to believe that it's possible that you could effectively wipe the virus out on the Australian continent. Although, again, as we start to open the place up again, that might be a little bit more challenging. But without domestic eradication and without a vaccine, I think it's going to be a while before we see large public gatherings of people. So as much as I'd like to say that we'll definitely have, 80,000 people at the Melbourne Cup or 100,000, I think it's less likely than more likely at the moment. The racing industry's been, I think, a really exceptional tale. I don't think anyone believed, I certainly didn't believe that at the start of this, that racing would be able to effectively get through without having to stop for a significant period of time. I think they stopped for 2 days while Mark Zara's COVID-19 test was being analysed, and it stopped in about 3 states. And when that came back negative, racing was able to keep going. I think what they did very well was they recognised early that if you put in place the right biosecurity measures and you put in place the right conduct by participants, then you could really substantially minimise your possibility of spreading the virus through your sporting code. And so closing the borders, making sure, it's difficult for jockeys and trainers and owners because people are used to bringing them, taking themselves and their horses all around the country. But in an environment where the very future of the code is at stake, it's a small price to pay to say, well, Victorian participants will stay in Victoria and New South Wales participants will stay over there, and you won't have people travelling all over the country to race. So they locked down very early. They put in place really strict distancing requirements, separate jockey rooms. It is a sport where social distancing is naturally, available to them. They're not all belting into each other. So they've just done it really, really well. They've had no outbreaks, no risks. They've, even down to the point where I got a call last week from people connected to the Warrnambool Standard, wanting to have a journo and a photographer on track for the May races today and tomorrow. And Racing Victoria said, no, our protocols are nobody on course except those people who absolutely have to be there. And so they had to reluctantly say no. And they've said no to newspapers and to all kinds of people. I haven't been inside a racetrack, so they have been incredibly strict. And the industry has been able to go on. And I should say, for people who have been stuck at home, having the races on when nothing else is on has been a very, very welcome diversion.
Certainly has. And it's more Ballarat Cup that we're worried about than those big ones down in Melbourne too, Minister.
Yeah. Oh, no. Look, you know, if crowds can come back for Flemington and Moonee Valley, then they'll be back for Ballarat. And if they're not back for the big ones in Melbourne, then they probably won't be back for Ballarat either.
Jane, any comments you'd like to make before we finish up?
No.
Thank you for your input, and thank you. And I hope your takeaway and your modified market continues to be some way of success to pay for some of those staff and some of those ongoing costs that you still have to face. Thank you, Minister, for your extremely valuable time and always friendly to our industries. Can I thank Commerce Ballarat? So thanks to Zoe, who set up our meeting, to Jody and to Nick. Make sure you keep your eye on their website and on their socials to keep up to date with everything. I woke up this morning to the good news that $4 billion a week this is costing our economy, and the way out was through shopping, dining and travel, the three things that we do very, very well in this city. So let's be optimistic. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.